morning. It is quite a privilege and a blessing to be together, to worship God, to begin this week, this first day of the week, to dedicate it to God, and hopefully that this is just the start of a dedication to God and our love for Him and zeal for Him throughout this week. If you're visiting with us, we want you to know how much you are wanted and welcome right here at Westhill. We want to help as many people as we possibly can to get to heaven. And we're here together not only to worship God, but to inspire one another, to go out into our communities and change the world. And that's what the gospel is about. It's not just to take it in and sit on it and hold it to ourselves, but it is to imbibe and feast upon it so that it becomes part of who we are, and we take it out into the community, and others are impacted by the gospel which we live, which we speak, and which we teach to others. I hope that appeals to you, and if you're looking for a church home, and that's what you want to do, we want you here at Westhill. We want those that have the energy and the desire to go out and change this world. As Paul described in Acts chapter 17, turn the world upside down. We're here to turn Corsicana upside down, to put it on its head, to let them know that there has been a prophet among them. We think about this world, there are certain things about children especially that we love. You know, we like to hold the newborn baby and just smell of them. You know, we like to teach them and train them to dress them in certain ways, to get them to do funny things like eat lemons and pickles and things like that. But one of my favorite things was, it was always when my boys would ask the questions of origin. Things like, you know, some of them very complex. Where do babies come from? And so you have this long, drawn-out explanation about, you know, God and a mother and a father and how they love one another, and eventually the child comes. And then, where do eggs come from, Dad? And so you explain the farm elements and things like that. You know, where does gas come from? You tell them Taco Bell, and you go through all these things in life, and there's so many origin questions, and we love to explain those things. And I think as we get older, maybe we lose that curiosity. Sometimes it's because we have gained enough knowledge that we can, if we haven't seen the origin or don't know the origin, we can figure it out just by putting bits and pieces of knowledge together. But sometimes we're still reduced to asking someone, hey, where does that come from? How did that begin? Sometimes, though, we never get to the right answer. Hope is kind of that way. When it comes to the origin of hope, a lot of people, either they just don't care. They're not concerned about hope, or, you know, it just kind of falls upon them. They're happy to have it, and they go about their life, and they're not concerned about its origins. Or else a lot of people, they just aren't curious about hope, or maybe they have come to the wrong conclusions about the origin of hope. You know, there are many people who get confused when it comes to salvation. Maybe they have bought into the man-made religions or the doctrines of demons, and they've secured for themselves a false hope. Paul was concerned about this in 1 Thessalonians 5. In verse 3, when he speaks that there is peace and security, while people are saying there is peace and security, then sudden destruction comes upon them as labor pains upon a pregnant woman, and they will not escape. I think Paul had very clearly in mind the words of the prophet Jeremiah from Jeremiah chapter 6 and verse 14, when they were saying, peace, peace, when there was no peace. Certainly, we see that there are those throughout history who have gained this false idea of hope, this false security. And as a result, they are traveling down the wrong path. But of others, we might say not that it was just a false hope, but that in fact there was blinded by the suffering. Some people don't come to hope because they are blinded by their suffering. Jeremiah in the book of Lamentations certainly fell into that category. In Lamentation chapter 3, as you open the chapter, he begins talking about how he was constantly afflicted by sorrow. Every corner that he turned, every place that he looked, there was sorrow, sorrow, and more sorrow. By the time you get down to Lamentation 3 and verse 17, he would say, my soul is bereft of peace. I have forgotten happiness. So I say, my endurance has perished, and so has my hope from the Lord. Think about those words as Jeremiah is looking over his life, and he's struggling with those questions about, where's my hope coming from? Why is my hope lost? How come I can't see my hope? And he has this idea of peace. I have no peace. He finally recognizes what he'd been preaching all along to the children of Israel. They were saying peace, peace when there is no peace. Jeremiah understands, I have no peace. God has targeted me for my iniquity. God has torn me down. He has broken me down because of sin. I am bereft of peace. I have forgotten, he says, what happiness is. We prize in our country this pursuit of happiness. That it is a goal that is attainable, that if we walk the right path, if we do the right things, we'll eventually lay hold on happiness, and we can't possibly lose it. And yet, Jeremiah says, I've forgotten what happiness is. I knew it one time. I knew when I would go into the temple of the Lord what the happiness of God was. I knew when I'd walk the paths of righteousness what happiness was. I knew when the blessings of God showered upon us what happiness was, but those things have been taken away, and I have forgotten happiness. Endurance has perished, and so has my hope. As we think about hope, in our continuing series on hope, we see that some people are just blinded by suffering, and they can't see a hope in this world. But thankfully, Jeremiah comes to this conclusion where he learns the origin of hope. He says, my soul continually remembers it, that is the bitterness that he is in, and is bowed down within me. He says, as I dwell upon my suffering, as I dwell upon the bad things that are happening, the hope disappears from me, and I begin to spiral down into the depths of despair and depression. And we see that even today. There are those who struggle with depression and despair, and they have a hard time seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. They have a hard time refocusing their lives so they're not dwelling on their own problems. Because as we dwell on our pains and our aches, as we dwell upon how we've been slighted and offended by other people, and we dwell upon the things that we don't have and we wish we had, and we start looking at the poor as me syndrome, it gets worse and worse, and we make mountains out of molehills, things that shouldn't amount to anything because we focus on our problems. But finally, Jeremiah, he breaks out of that rut, and he says, but this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. In the midst of my despair, when I think hope is gone and happiness is lost, I call this to mind, and I have hope. If you have your Bibles and haven't already done so, turn to Lamentations 3. As we look at the origin of hope and how Jeremiah says that the origin of my hope is the Lord is my portion. We sing that in the song sometimes. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore, I will hope in him. Well, let's look at this context, this one paragraph, three ideas that we get hope. Hope for us today resides not just in ourselves, but really in God's unending mercy. As he says in Lamentation 3 in verse 22, the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. Let's look for just a moment at this idea of steadfast love. The Hebrew word is used over 250 times just in the Old Testament. The concept is translated most often as mercy or pity, steadfast love. Some translations have loving kindness. The loving kindness of the Lord never ceases, or the steadfast love of the Lord, the compassion which God showers upon us never ceases. It never comes to an end. The word is used throughout the Old Testament, and the concept, of course, in the New Testament defines, number one, our attitudes as human beings toward one another. It might refer to, for example, how we treat our friends with compassion and with love, how we might treat our families, how we might treat the poor who are among us, reaching out to them in compassion, trying to alleviate their pain and their suffering. Jesus even uses the concept in Matthew chapter 5 in the Great Sermon on the Mount that this is the relationship we're to have toward our enemies. Love your enemies. Have a steadfast love toward them. Many times we start to define love by how or what kind of love that person deserves from me. We look at their lives. Well, this person deserves this kind of love. This person deserves this kind of fidelity from me. Aren't we thankful God didn't look upon us and say, what kind of love does mankind deserve? That God would look down upon us and love us despite our sin, in spite of our iniquity, and turning away from Him. And so this idea of the loving kindness can refer to human relationships between one another, but it comes to its fullest meaning, to its most noteworthy as it reveals to us God's attitude toward errant mankind. It is the love and the compassion that He demonstrates to us in His willingness to turn away the wrath that we properly deserve. Out of love, God saves mankind. It is this steadfast love that causes Him to reach to us. Too often we start thinking that, hey, my salvation is because of all the things that I've done. I've obeyed the gospel. I've done all of these wonderful things. God is going to save me. But really, we need to understand that our hope does not lie in what we have done for God. Our hope truly lies in what God has done for us. What He has seen in us was sin and iniquity, yet He is willing to send His Son as a sacrifice so that we can be the objects of His steadfast love. It's not what we have done, it's what He has done for us that saves us. And it prompted, for example, the great prophet Joel, who said, return to the Lord your God. What is he says? Rend your hearts and not your garments. They were so often taking the garments and trying to show remorse for what they were doing, and they would tear their cloaks or they would tear their tunics and to show that they were remorseful for what they've done, but truly inside they really hadn't changed. And so Joel comes and he says, if you're truly sorry for your sin, rend your hearts and not your garments. Tear the internal spirit. Return to the Lord your God, for He is gracious and merciful, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love, and He relents over disaster. I like how Joel here uses many terms which are synonymous. We do this a lot of times when we're trying to emphasize the point. He was glad and happy and exuberant, and he was jumping for joy and jubilant. All these things. We try to line up these synonyms to emphasize just how much that state is true. And so here, Joel does the same thing. He says that God is gracious, that he bestows upon us a favor or a grace, giving us gifts that we simply do not deserve. But He is also merciful, withholding from us the punishment that we do deserve. And though the words themselves are not identical, they carry the same basic ideas. He is slow to anger. There again, God brings in the same thing, and abounding in steadfast love. And there's our phrase that we began with, this steadfast love of God, this unending mercy that He shows upon us. And He's willing to turn away His wrath and relent over the disasters. I like Psalm 136. It only has 26 verses. But every one of the 26 verses ends with the phrase, His steadfast love endures forever. That quality of God that seeks to save mankind endures forever. Readers of the psalm are encouraged to give thanks to God for His creative power, for His rescue of the exiles, for His victory over the mighty foes that we faced, and for His watch care over us. And each time He ends, for the steadfast love of the Lord endures forever. All of this, not because we deserve it, but because we do not deserve it. You see, God showed His love for us in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Romans 5 and verse 8. And that mercy, he says in this verse, has an eternal reservoir. It never runs out. In fact, he says in Deuteronomy 7, beginning in verse 9, "Know therefore that the Lord your God is God, the faithful God who keeps covenant and steadfast love." There's our phrase again, this steadfast love that God keeps with those who keep or love Him and keep His commandments. Notice, to 1,000 generations. 1,000 generations, meaning that it keeps going and going and going and going. It is part of God's nature, this mercy, this loving kindness, because of His desire to rescue man from peril. Because of God's desire to rescue me from peril. I have hope. That's what Jeremiah is saying. I have hope because of that. Number two, though, we see in verse 23, God's renewed faithfulness. Verse 23, he says, "They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness." Not only is God's love and mercy unending, the proofs of them are continually renewed to us, and we are reminded of them. With men, time often diminishes our benevolence and fealty toward others. We grate on one another's nerves, we break faith, we insult one another, we slight one another, we backbite, we slander, we ridicule, we forget. And amid such disregard that we often have for one another, we lose these beneficent feelings toward one another. But not God. You see, no matter how much we slight Him, no matter how much we attack Him with our sin, no matter how much we offend Him by our words, He proves His love and kindness day after day after day after day. In fact, what the Bible tells us is that He renews our sustenance daily. Give us this day our daily bread, as we were taught to pray in Matthew 6 and verse 11. Like the morning manna of old, as they would wake up and exit their tents in the morning, and the manna would cover the ground, knowing that this was God providing for them their daily bread, their daily sustenance, and it was renewed every single day except on the Sabbath. But there was enough given the day before the Sabbath to keep them through the Sabbath. So every day they were sustained by the bread which came from heaven. Jesus, of course, would speak of Himself being the bread of heaven, this bread of life in John chapter 6. Not only does He renew our sustenance, He renews our spirits daily. So we do not lose heart, we're told in 2 Corinthians 4 and verse 16. Though our outer man is wasting away, our inner self is being renewed day by day. This renewal isn't just some great effort on our part, but it is our connection to God and His Spirit that because of our love for Him and our allegiance to Him, it renews us daily. It is part of God's work in our lives. And so He renews our spirits. And we'd also say here that He renews our salvation daily. O Lord, be gracious to us. We wait for You. Be our arm every morning, our salvation in the times of trouble. Isaiah 33 and verse 2. Be our arm every morning, our salvation in the time of trouble. Every day, God is with us, renewing that vow of salvation toward us, cleansing us, renewing our spirits, making us meet for the heavenly realm. No matter how far we may drift, God welcomes us home, forgives us, washes us clean. And because of that, I have hope, like Jeremiah who would speak. And then finally, I have hope because of God's continuing portion. Verse 24, it's one of those great verses. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore, I will hope in him. As God prepared the wandering nation to leave Egypt and go throughout the wilderness wanderings, he was telling them all along that he was going to bring them to the promised land, the land of an inheritance, remember? And he says to the Levites, he says that they would not have a part in his possession. Notice Numbers 18, verse 20. He says to Aaron, you shall have no part or have no inheritance in their land, neither shall you have any portion among them. We feel sorry for Levi. What is it about Levi that he doesn't get to have an inheritance? You've spoken for generations, God, of the greatness of the promised land, the land that flows with milk and honey, of the inheritance that they would receive, and how this would be their inheritance forever, to the end of the great age, God. And now all of a sudden you say to Levi, you can't have a parcel of land. You don't get a territory. But whatever sorrow we feel on Levi's behalf is immediately replaced by God saying, for I am your portion. They're getting dirt. You're getting God. And that, in the mind of the spiritual person, that is the greater blessing. Those that understand the presence of God. I am your portion and your inheritance. I am more than suffice what you lose in land and acreage. You gain in adherence to God. And so here Jeremiah realizes that this is the greatest blessing. The greatest blessing wasn't the inheritance of a land. The greatest blessing is God. It isn't the things that God can do. It isn't the things that God gives us, but it is God himself. He is our dearest treasure. The glory of heaven isn't the streets of gold. The glory of heaven are not the undying day or the mansion over the hilltop. When we think about the glories of heaven, we have to understand the glory of heaven is God himself, to stand in the presence of God, to bask in his glory. We are overwhelmed with him. Not with what he gives, but with him. He is our portion. He is our greatest treasure. And that's why Jeremiah finishes in the lamentation, therefore, I will hope in him. Therefore, my hope, my desire is all about him. Because he gives himself to me. Because God dedicates himself to my salvation. I have confidence. I have hope. Why do you have hope? Is it because the God of love and mercy is faithful to us to be our portion and our great treasure? You know, as the world seeks hope and an origin for their hope, they find it in money, and they find it in big homes. They find it in friendships. They find it in popularity. They search the world over trying to find that place that brings good and lasting hope. And yet what they're confronted with is the hostility of the environment of the world. That this world does not bring that lasting hope that they want. Many people are like Jeremiah. They are bereft of peace and forgotten happiness and are failing to live. But then Jeremiah, he learns the lesson. When I was thinking about my problems, that's when my problems seemed so big. But when I cast my cares on God and I looked to him for hope, all of a sudden my hope was restored. My happiness came home. This is where the church shows its greatest blessings. By revealing this hope to a lost world. Is your hope in just doing good? Maybe there's some here who are trying to live off God's radar, outside of God's scope. He won't notice what I'm doing. But he does. You can't have hope trying to live outside of God's view. You cannot have hope just in trying to do good in this life. You can't have true hope if you're waiting for the right time to obey him. Or do you not realize that your salvation is in question? And as long as your salvation is in question, you have no hope. You have no confidence in the grace of God. Honesty opens that door of salvation. Do you remember the words of Jesus? It says, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come into him and eat with him and he with me." This morning, the Lord is outside the door knocking, offering you hope. Will you take it? Will you respond to his invitation to become his child and gain confidence this morning while we stand and while we sing?